and welcome to Freedom Fighters Code Gray. This is a show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's happening across Canada and in our own backyard. Some of the content in today's show may be triggering for viewers, as we will be dealing with subject matter related to exploitation and trauma. For information and support related to human trafficking in Canada, you can call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. In this program, at Freedom Fighters Code Gray, in every episode, we have shared that hotline number, and it's operated by the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. Well, today I'm so excited to be joined by Julia Drydyk, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, to share about the valuable work that they're doing to address this issue nationally. Welcome, Julia. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today.
So to start off with, I was wondering if you can share a bit about the Centre. What is the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking? Why did it start? When did it start? Just all of those details would be really helpful.
Absolutely. The Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking was founded in 2016, actually on the tails of a major task force that was funded by the Canadian Women's Foundation. So there was a 2-year process where actually the co-founders of the center had spent time traveling the country to better understand the realities of specifically sex trafficking in Canada. That resulted in a report, but they didn't just want to have all of that work and everything they learned kind of collect dust on a shelf. And so they founded the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking to really be that backbone agency to raise awareness, but also to help fuel a movement to end human trafficking in Canada. So while that piece of work was largely focused on sex trafficking, the center also equally focuses on labor trafficking. So that's specifically, it's a little bit different than what we're probably going to talk about today, but that's largely where you're seeing migrant workers come in through temporary foreign worker contracts be exploited. So in our work, we do a lot of work in research and identifying best practices, really bringing people together. We do a lot of public education awareness. We're doing some policy advocacy as well. But as you mentioned, we also operate the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, which is our 24/7 confidential resource for all Canadians, be it if they or someone they know is being exploited, or if you just want information and tools and resources.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Julia. I think it's so interesting that this organization, and as you mentioned, which is becoming a backbone in terms of, facilitating collaboration and research, and the hotline, which is an essential need and tool for the community, really started by some folks who were doing a report, found out what was happening across trafficking and said, we need to do more. And so I think that's just incredible that they took that step towards action, and that here you are today continuing this great work. And you mentioned that there are different services and supports that you're offering to folks in the community. And so how can someone listening to the program today access that service and support from the center?
Yeah, so in operating the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, we have partnerships with over 900 frontline service delivery partners from coast to coast to coast.
Wow.
And through those organizations, they're providing close to 3,000 unique programs and services, everything from housing, case management, legal supports, mental health, and counseling. So for anyone that calls us in distress, also be it through human trafficking or in us being able to access general resources, we can provide those referrals to programs in your community based on your needs. But we also have a public-facing national referral directory. So you can also check out our website at www.canadianhumantraffickinghotline.ca. It's not necessarily the full scope of services that you get when you call the hotline, because some have very long wait lists. And so they really work on us to kind of provide that triage and support. But you can also check it out yourself and scan and search according to the type of services that you're looking for based on the community you're in.
Wow, that is so incredible. Like you just mentioned, thousands of services and programs across the country, and folks are able to, no matter where they are and which province or territory that they're in, they can reach out and get more information about what potential supports might fit their needs at any given time in their healing journey. And I just think that's really incredible. You've been mentioning, the words human trafficking, you mentioned sex trafficking, you mentioned labor trafficking. And some folks who might be viewing our show today haven't heard about the realities of human trafficking in Canada, and they might not even know what human trafficking is. So what is human trafficking, and what are the different kinds of exploitation, the different types of trafficking that you're seeing across the nation?
You know, that's such a great question. I'm going to loop it back to your previous one about what can our viewers do. And I think one of the biggest things they can do is also check out our website to understand more about the realities of human trafficking in Canada. In 2021, we conducted some public opinion polling research to kind of gauge what Canadians understood about human trafficking. 77% of Canadians felt like human trafficking was a serious issue, but the same percentage had no idea what to do if they were to document or see the signs in their community. And similarly, like a huge proportion of Canadians still think that human trafficking is happening to other people in other countries or being smuggled across border. No offense to Liam Neeson, but the legacy of the movie Taken and kind of fueling those myths and misperceptions is still a major issue that we're dealing with every day. We've even talked to survivors who said that because they thought they needed to be handcuffed or chained, they didn't understand how it took place. It actually made it harder for them to reach out for help because they didn't think that they were deserving. So we really want to debunk those myths. We really want to share information about what some of the earlier signs and indicators are, because in the world that I'm working towards, which is one where human trafficking doesn't exist, we'll be able to pick up on it before it even gets there. And so really it will take a whole kind of community response. In terms of what human trafficking looks like in our communities, specifically sex trafficking, it looks far more like intimate partner violence than what you see in the movies. So traffickers identify someone who is vulnerable, and that can mean a million different things. It could mean that they're just, they're feeling insecure, they're having problems at home, low self-esteem. They also look to people in situations of homelessness or underhousing or who are living in poverty. They love bomb them. They shower them with all of, the hopes and dreams and aspirations they could ever want. And then they quickly pull that back and use tools of like psychological control and coercion to force them into the commercial sex industry, where they are profiting grossly. So while it can often start looking like, a pinch yourself perfect relationship that you'd never seen, towards the end of the exploitation, a lot of the survivors that we work with have zero control. They don't control when they can eat, where they can sleep, who they can talk to, where they can go. They're being surveyed, monitored, and they're being forced to commit sexual acts for money where the trafficker profits, sometimes several times a day for days on end, months on end, sometimes years.
Wow. There are so many important things that you have highlighted there when discussing human trafficking in Canada. And I think talking about the misconception that human trafficking doesn't happen here, or human trafficking is happening to another group of people in another place in another time, and not recognizing that it's really happening everywhere and it can happen to anyone, is so crucial and so important for folks to know. So I appreciate the way that you've identified some of the myths and misconceptions that have been brought forward by films and media, but then also pointing to the realities of what this is looking like in our community. You mentioned what it kind of looks like when someone is experiencing exploitation in the commercial sex industry and trafficking there. But what about other forms of trafficking? Are you seeing other kinds of trafficking here in Canada? And if yes, what are some of those?
So this year's public awareness campaign that we're in the middle of right now is actually focused on reaching out to migrant workers and to raise awareness about labor trafficking. So we developed resources that are in communities across Canada, but specifically where we know there's a lot of temporary foreign workers, to talk about their rights, but also to raise awareness about the hotline. I do have to say that since we've started raising awareness, we've seen a noticeable increase in labor trafficking calls to the hotline. I think it's also gotten some additional attention from law enforcement. So the thing with labor trafficking is I wouldn't say that it's like increasing at dramatic rates, because I think it's always been really, really bad. It's just now we're starting to raise awareness of it. Similarly, with sex trafficking, it was largely undocumented and unreported for a long time because people didn't know what to look for. They didn't even know how to have conversations with individuals that would work and that were trauma-informed. So now that we're building that awareness and getting better at doing harm reduction, non-judgmental, trauma-informed outreach and engagement, we're seeing the numbers go up because I think we're finally starting to actually serve our communities in need.
That's a really interesting point that you've made, that as we educate folks, as we raise awareness in the community, as we learn more about the issue ourselves, that we're seeing more referrals being made, whether that's from an agency or a service provider or from an individual themselves, right? Because you already kind of talked about how someone could be in a situation of trafficking and not fully aware that they are experiencing exploitation because of myths they believed about, whether it was handcuffs as you identified or something else, right? And so as we share with folks and give information and tools to them to help them identify their situation and also know where to go to reach out to for help, like the hotline number. That's really interesting that you think, it's kind of always been there, but we are able to identify it more because we're getting this information out there. And so that's part of the reason that you're seeing an increase in trafficking. And I know that you've also done some work in identifying various kinds of human trafficking trends since the centers began. And so I'm wondering about what were some of the findings from the reports that you have done, and what are some of the trends that you are seeing as it relates to trafficking in Canada?
So in 2019, we conducted research to understand what we call human trafficking corridors in Canada. And it's actually very timely because today there was actually just coverage of a situation where a minor was being systematically moved across the country, trafficked by people, and actually reached out to a friend. And that friend called the hotline, and it resulted actually in police intervening and the minor escaping her situation. Unfortunately, this is not a normal in our lives, in our line of work. Also, family and friends reaching out to the hotline is the second biggest group reaching out to the hotline for support. And that can sometimes be the most effective, because sometimes you really need to support the communities to support the individuals. But we also released data in 2022, just last year, documenting our first full year of operating the hotline. And there we found statistical backup of what we knew anecdotally for a long time. That while men and trans folks are impacted by human trafficking, it is largely a gender-based crime, especially in sex trafficking. 90% of victims and survivors identified as female. We also found, again, that the vast majority are Canadian-born. So as much as people think that this is an issue of people being shipped across from other countries and smuggled into Canada and forced into the commercial sex industry, largely we're finding it's Canadian women and girls that are being targeted.
Wow. Julia, you have shared so many insights to help us better understand how trafficking is happening in Canada. And I'm grateful for the impactful work that you and your team are doing to address this growing crime. We are going to be right back to continue this discussion after we take a short break.
Tuesdays on City TV.
It blew me away.
It doesn't even look real. It looks like a special effect.
We've done some moves we have never, ever seen.
This is an audition I'll never forget. It was amazing.
America's Got Talent. All new Tuesdays 8, 7 Central on City TV or stream anytime.
And welcome back to Freedom Fighters Code Gray, a show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's taking place across Canada and in our own backyard. Today, I'm joined by Julia Drydyk, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. And we are talking about the important work that they're doing to offer services and resources to the community, but also how we can better understand what this issue looks like and how exploitation is taking place in our community. Right before the break, Julia shared a statistic that 90% of individuals who are impacted by trafficking in Canada are women and girls. Julia, could you just take some time to explain why is this the case? Why is it that women and girls are not just the majority, but very clearly the majority of the people who are being exploited by this crime?
So I think we need to understand sex trafficking as gender-based violence, and men and trans folks absolutely experience too. Trans folks are overrepresented. But really, I think why we're seeing this is because there's still a view out there, despite the progress we've made, that women are inferior to men, right? Like that they do not matter as much as men, that they are disposable. As much as there is a strong sense of sexual empowerment, there's also a strong sense of commodifying of women's bodies, right? And maybe not us being seen as full human beings in this world with the same kind of rights. So I think when we're looking at this, I think you also need to look at instances of intimate partner violence and how overwhelmingly it's women that are experiencing abuse from men. The fact that femicide is still an issue in Canada. Similarly, we saw the recent attacks on universities and classes of gender studies. So while there has been a lot of progress, I think one of the reasons we're seeing this gross form of violence and exploitation put on women is because there's still parts of our society that believe that women aren't worth as much as men.
This is heavy, and this is the sad, unfortunate reality of what women are experiencing in Canada. And so as a society, what do you think are some of the changes that need to be made in order to address gender-based violence issues like human trafficking? And how can we support people who are being impacted by exploitation?
So in the world I'm working to create, it is one where Canadian society is impenetrable to human trafficking. Mm-hmm. And that is because every youth, every person has access to opportunity and choices and supports in their lives, which mean that even if someone is exploiting them, they've got that additional kind of arsenal around them to be able to get out of unhealthy relationships and to move on. So I think sometimes there's a little bit of almost victim blaming when we talk about vulnerabilities. But I do think we need to look at things like our housing system, right? And how like the housing crisis is fueling inequality and making it so hard for people to keep a roof over their heads, meaning that they can be desperate for choices at times. I think we need to be looking at things like access to education and opportunity. As much as we've, free public school systems, we do know that it can be hard to break the cycle and to make sure that folks if their parents didn't go to university, they're actually getting in on those opportunities. We need an economy that works for people and not just people that work for an economy. Because I think that where you've got opportunities, choice, and where we've seen instances of anti-human trafficking efforts work is where we're really leveling the playing field, right? And it's where everyone has those opportunities. I do also think that we need to be looking at the flip side of what I was just talking about. And how is it that anyone, or even, men, think that women are disposable or that they can be used for their own profit, even at horrible levels of exploitation and abuse. But I think part of that is social and it's structural, and it's about making sure that, we're trying from day one, when a new Canadian is in this world, either they're born here or they come later, that they're given equal opportunity to be able to live a good life, and one where there's like meaningful opportunities for growth and development. I think it's where people are stuck and desperate that often exploiters look to take advantage of them. And a really stark example of that right now is even with regard to the Ukrainian war with Russia. And we know that like with refugees leaving, there are heightened amounts of exploitation and sex trafficking and abuse. So again, we want a world where hopefully no one is ever in that position of like systemic and structural inequality, so that can be our first line of defense against traffickers who try to take advantage of other people for their own gain.
You've outlined, a big task for us, right? It requires collective effort, individual effort, there are changes that need to happen systemically in regards to attitudes and beliefs and mindsets. You've highlighted the importance of education and creating access to opportunities. And so there's really, a part that everyone can play to help fight human trafficking and do something to stand up against gender-based violence and make the changes that we want to see so that no one else experiences exploitation in Canada. I know that the Centre to End Human Trafficking really values evidence-informed approaches. And so even the statistics that you're sharing today and the information comes from collecting data, reviewing, academic review journals and all of those things to ensure that we are approaching this issue with integrity. And so I would like to know a bit more about why do you think it's so important that research is conducted by the center or by others as well in this fight to address human trafficking?
I think one of those, we already talked about how poorly understood the issue is. So with so many myths and misperceptions, I think it's really important to have research with strong methodological standards that we can actually combat some of the myths out there. Because, if you're putting out public policy and programs that are targeted towards forcible confinement of migrants coming across the border, it's not going to address the problem that we have right here. And so we need to be doing that work in a way that is well done and reflective of reality, because if you know what the problem is, you're never going to fix it. But also I will say that human trafficking is a rapidly adapting crime. So anecdotally, folks often say that, it's low risk, high reward. And other sayings have gone around that say that it's pretty high risk to move and traffic drugs and guns, because you can get caught with it and it's a one-time deal. With human trafficking, you can traffic a person over and over and over again, and it's incredibly hard to prosecute. And so I think that we need to be conducting ethical, thoughtful, and methodologically sound research so that we're keeping ahead and really understanding how trends are changing. An example of that is also the increase in online sexual exploitation during COVID. Right? A lot of people would have assumed the world closed down, so did the commercial sex market. Actually, we were seeing a real increase in online luring and grooming, but also sexual exploitation happening through webcamming and other remote sexual activities. So we need to be doing this work in an impartial way as well, so that we can actually design systems of intervention that are going to work and that aren't, focused on trends from 10, 15 years ago.
And based on some of the research that the center has undertaken, are there any key findings or learnings that you feel like would be relevant to share today?
Well, I think part of it too is the data that we have and our understanding of the extent of the issue is really just the tip of the iceberg. Especially at the hotline, not every survivor of sex trafficking is going to contact the hotline, right? So it's really just a snapshot in terms of the trends we're seeing, and we're lucky to have that vantage point as a national organization. But I think also it's been helpful to demonstrate what we've known as frontline service delivery partners and people in the sector for years, right? Like, this is a domestic issue. This is an issue that's largely being experienced by Canadian women and girls. Labor trafficking is different through independent research we conducted with temporary foreign workers and migrant workers. There, we're really seeing that it's actually people coming in through very specific immigration systems and being exploited in our agricultural systems and manufacturing. But again, these are things that we've known for a long time, and now it's really helpful to be able to have it in black and white to be able to show policymakers, decision makers, but also people that want to help. So again, we can all be on the same page and work together.
You've already shared so many facts and insights about, what human trafficking is in Canada and how it's happening. But I'm wondering if you feel like there's anything else that the community should really know about human trafficking in Canada.
This is a bit of a sneak ahead, but we do have another data release coming up in July. And part of it does show that also contrary to public belief, human trafficking, while the vast majority of it happens in large urban centers, we're also seeing it in rural and mid-sized communities. I will also just say anecdotally, I don't think that there's a single community in Canada that has not contacted the hotline at this point, from the smallest hamlets to the biggest, municipalities and urban centers. So unfortunately, it is happening everywhere. I don't think that this means that we need to have a moral panic, but I do think that we need to start talking about it openly and honestly, and keeping our eyes open, and knowing that anyone should be open to asking for help, because this can be really hard to navigate and can also be dangerous at points. So I think it's important that people really pull on those resources, including the hotline and those services in their communities.
You mentioned that anecdotally, communities across the nation, rural, large urban centers have been reaching out to the hotline. And I just want to say, I think that is also a testament on the flip side to the great work the center is doing to get the tools out there, to get the resources out there, to get the hotline number into the hands of people in spaces large or small, rural or city, to be able to reach out for support. So thank you that in a short number of years that you've really been able to get that number into so many people's hands as well. And so how can folks tuning in today learn more about the great work that you and your team are doing?
So you can check out our website for the center at www.canadiancentertoendhumantrafficking.ca. And there we've got research reports, we've got policy briefs. You can kind of track some of the stuff that's happening federally and provincially around human trafficking legislation. But for people that might be worried that something is wrong for them or someone in their lives, please check out our website at www.canadianhumantraffickinghotline.ca. That's much more focused on providing resources and tools specifically to individuals who might be in crisis or needing supports. And of course, anyone can call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline toll-free anytime, 365 days a year at 1-833-900-1010. It's not like 911. We don't we only report to law enforcement if we're asked to, or if we have a duty to report. So no question is too small or too big. And we also have professional trained and bilingual hotline response advocates who are there to help. So really, I do hope people know it's an open resource, and we're here for you.
Really quickly, with the short time we have left, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Just that I really do think that education awareness is vital for us getting to the next stages of ending human trafficking. Unfortunately, in a lot of the trainings that we do, as we start actually building out that knowledge, often disclosures come forward. It's far more prevalent than I think we'd like to think. So really, even just by tuning in and educating yourself, you're doing a lot. And even sharing information in your communities and with your friends and family.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share today about the Center to End Human Trafficking, the services that your team are offering to the community, like the hotline number, and the evidence-informed resources you are sharing are incredibly valuable. So thank you so much, Julia, for the essential work that you and your team are doing. Again, the Canadian hotline number is 1-833-900-1010 if you were looking for information and support related to human trafficking. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of Freedom Fighters Code Gray. We hope to catch you next time.